wondered how we got here? There's so much to unpack, so as we honor our ancestors, let's take a step back to the struggles, the triumphs, and all the victory laps.
History is critical in terms of understanding political science.
As political scientists, you can't understand the present without knowing how the present arose.
We have to partner with our historians to make certain that the story is told and that it is told right.
History helps us to hopefully continually give us that warning signal like, hey, this has happened before and we need to do our best, to not repeat the same mistakes.
If you don't know where you've been, you won't know where you're going. And for us, it's important that we know the history so that we can tell the stories in ways that help to benefit our platforms.
History is important, yes, but whose history is also as important.
We cannot allow others to tell our story. So it's important that we exist in these spaces because a lot of the work that we are doing has real life consequences.
Historically, Black political scientists were not, I would say voices were not heard in the same way as white political scientists.
There are narratives that simply aren't true, and we need more professors in the discipline of political science and history to change those narratives.
Stories of double consciousness. Double consciousness, as Du Bois puts it, essentially means, how we understand ourselves as Black people through our own unique lens versus how we understand ourselves as Black people kind of through the lens of white America.
I also think it's important to understand the history of INCOPES. We were born out of protest, sort of, against the American Political Science Association.
And what we found inside the APSA at this time was a shine away from putting at the forefront the issues and the concerns of African Americans in particular, but people of African descent and people of color in general. APSA would not recognize that a specific category of study could be organized around the Black experience. And therefore, there were those within the organization who felt that in order to get this kind of scholarship out and to move forward, they had to leave APSA, which was very, very resistant to talking about the Black experience.
When we started this organization in 1968, there were maybe 20 Black people with PhDs in political science. Only 5 women. Now we don't even know the number because most of the people here have those degrees.
When INCOPES was founded, it was largely founded among members who were at historically Black colleges and universities. And we now know that many more of our members are at predominantly white institutions. And so we have to think about how does that then reframe the work of INCOPES? Not necessarily the mission, because the mission remains the same.
For those who don't know, there's beauty in resistance, and it's manifested through the work and responsibility of Black political scientists.
The founder of our department, Dr. Mac Jones, he was very clear, on our responsibilities as Black scholars.
The founding chair of our doctoral program at Clark Atlanta University, who, by the way, was the founding president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, Dr. Mac H. Jones. Many of us hold very dear to our hearts his important contribution to the discipline. And he's written extensively on what ought to be the responsibility of the Black political scientists to the community.
As political scientists, we're scarce resources of our community. And so we need both to understand and be the voice of our people's struggle. We need to be the chroniclers of our people's struggles.
In addition to understanding a certain kind of reality, it is the responsibility of the political scientists to the Black community to offer solutions, and to offer solutions that are grounded in the unique experiences of Black people in that given space.
Black political scientists matter because we have a unique perspective.
An educational system where Black boys are suspended at rates that signal that they are disposable, and Black girls in South Carolina are flung around classrooms like rag dolls by security.
We need more colleagues as well as students to pursue PhDs so that they can, challenge the system.
The year 2020 brought a new challenge every day. Each moment was as unique and diverse as the shades of our skin. We saw politics up close and personal. Our response? Name our pain and speak up to make change.
We have amplified the voices of African American political scientists, not only in the United States, but globally.
But the pressing issues of the day are issues that unfortunately seem not to go away. These issues keep re-emerging, resurfacing.
White supremacy, racism, Islamophobia, neo-imperialism. I mean, these are big, broad words, but these are realities of our world right now.
As a political scientist, I, like many others, watch the news, read social media, and often come away shocked and dismayed at our current political and social climate.
You can't have a system that says what? For the people, by the people, and of the people, when you got a veto over the people.
The protests are pretty much always effective. It's just that Black political leadership moved away from using protests. So this effective tool is used more rarely.
All of these inequities are growing even more large, and these chasms are widening. It's almost disheartening sometimes just to see and know what was going on before and that that's exacerbated now in the world that we are in.
I mean, we can talk specifically about inequality and wealth, but we should also talk about inequality in terms of being able to access food, being able to access sanitary shelter. These inequalities are persistent in the U.S. society and other societies at large.
Another pressing issue, I would say, is economic relief. A lot of people in our communities are suffering due to the effects of this, unforeseen pandemic.
I'm constantly trying to straddle that line of do I need to do this career as a diversity and inclusion consultant as a way to make money so that I can live a sustainable life, or should I just go all the way into the art that's really important to me, like this Black liberation work that I'm doing?
2020 was a year like no other. Pain, trauma, and unrest all across the diaspora. We longed for meaningful change and relief, then saw history as the first Black woman was elected to the United States vice presidency.
We just came out of this election. So, of course, the 2020 election is definitely, as a political scientist, is definitely on your mind, because I say it's the election that won't go away.
It's a continuation of the legacy of Black women and their political work. And Black women saying, okay, it's time, right? It's time that we have not just only a symbolic seat at the table, but a real seat at the table.
To see a Black woman ascend to position of vice president, in a lot of ways, it shows, all the work that Black women have been doing, right?
Now that, we have a new administration in the White House, I am trying to see how do we move forward past the 4 years where we clearly had some white nationalist tones coming out of the White House.
It's been sort of difficult for many of us, living through a pandemic at the same time that we are going through an election where there's questions about the survival of democracy in the U.S.
I look forward to
these young activists being impactful on the state and local level and not just on the federal level.
It's your time to release all that is in you that will make the world better. Now more than ever, we need the skills and the know-how that you've developed.
As chair of the membership committee, I am extending a very special invitation for you to join us as a member of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists.
Africans, African descended peoples, peoples of color can feel a safe space to express their understandings of the political history of our communities, the struggles that we face.
I think it's really great to have, again, this liberated zone where all of these, yes, intellectuals, yes, professionals are coming together, but more importantly, these family members are welcoming people back. And it almost felt like a formal family reunion.
Every time Haynes saw me, he greeted me with a loud shout of my rich cousin, Paula. That was what, and it didn't matter where we were or how many people were around. This is what Haynes would yell out. Okay, so I didn't have to figure out, oh, I know, that's Haynes, right? But that was just, that's the kind of person that Haynes was. Very gregarious, giving, generous.
It's been a reunion. Every year we come back and we meet old friends.
To have that type of fellowship is comforting. It is as if everyone at that conference is lifting you.
It's important to have Black scholars around that can say, hey, this is the way to go. And I've been grateful that I've had a lot of Black scholars that have come along and said, I'll hold your hand, I'll show you the way.
Also gave me this confidence because I was in a space that was created for me.
We hope to see you at our conference in March, but if not, please consider becoming a member of our very special community.
All right. Greetings, everyone. My name is Don Wergs. I'm one of the program co-chairs, and I would like to welcome you to the closing plenary. This has indeed been a wonderful conference, and we are set to close out with a powerful discussion. Before we get started, though, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of the many, many people who had a role in putting this conference together. In particular, I want to acknowledge and thank our leaders, Sekou, Tiffany, and Kathy in particular. I also have to say a special word of thanks to my co-chairs, Gladys Mitchell-Walthour and Ollie Johnson. We were a great team, if I can say so myself. My colleagues, you all would be amazed at the level of commitment that they each displayed in order to make this conference a success. They really, literally did anything you could imagine, whatever was necessary to try to pull everything together. And I was particularly amazed to see such distinguished scholars like Dr. Johnson and Dr. Mitchell-Walthour doing the most menial of tasks, as well as reflecting and injecting some of their significant insight into what would be necessary for this conference and what it could possibly be. So I really appreciate their efforts. When we started the conference, we stated even in our welcome that we are hoping that the attendees would find the experience inspiring, reinvigorating, and strengthening. And I can speak for myself and say that I personally have found the conference to be extremely inspiring, and I feel strengthened. And I would say I was particularly inspired by our new president's address. So with that, the theme of this closing plenary is, where do we go from here? Possibilities and challenges for Black politics. And we put together an all-star panel to help us think about this question: where do we go from here? I will introduce, I will read the bios of each of our presenters, and then we will turn to our first presenter. We're going to be joined by Adolphus Belk, Lori Frazier, Cheryl Laird, and Casey Morrison. So I'll go through and read each of their bios, and when I've concluded that, we will hear opening remarks from each of them, and then we will open up for a broader discussion. So I assure you, you are in for a wonderful, insightful range of topics and really some compelling analysis about this political moment and what may lie in the future. So, Dr. Adolphus Belk, Jr. is a professor of political science and African American studies at Winthrop University. His research concentrates on the politics of crime and punishment, as well as white nationalism in American politics. His work has been published in the Journal of Race and Policy, Souls, a critical journal of Black studies, Culture and Society, the Journal of the Center for Policy Analysis and Research, the National Review of Black Politics, and by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Lastly, Dr. Belk and Dr. Lakita Bonnet Bailey are the co-editors of the forthcoming book, For the Culture, Hip Hop and the Fight for Social Justice. Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Lori Frazier, who is the Vice Chair and Associate Professor of Political Science with an appointment, with a joint appointment in African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She also serves as acting director of the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA for the current academic year. Dr. Frazier's research and teaching examines racial and ethnic political behavior, African American politics, women in politics, immigrant political incorporation, and state and local politics. Her current research is supported by the National Science Foundation, including the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, a national multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual post-election study of socio-political behavior and public policy preferences in the United States. Next, we will hear from Dr. Cheryl Laird, who is an assistant professor of government and legal studies at Bowdoin, I'm going to pronounce it, Bowdoin College. I could never pronounce that right. My apologies. She studies American politics with a focus on Black political behavior and public opinion. She has published scholarship in a number of academic journals, including the American Political Science Review, and her most recent work is her co-authored book, Steadfast Democrats: How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior, published with Princeton University Press. Her research has been featured in a number of news outlets, including The Atlantic, The Washington Post, New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, NPR, CNN, and MSNBC. And lastly, we will hear from Dr. Minion Kenneth Chauncey Casey Morrison, who is a professor in the Joe Biden School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Delaware. He has previously held positions at Syracuse University, the University of Missouri, and Mississippi State University. He has a BA from Tougaloo College and a master's and PhD in political science and African studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His publications, he's got a long list of publications in a wide range of journals that I can't list all of them, but I'll just give you a taste of it. His publications include Aaron Henry of Mississippi, Inside Agitator, which was published in 2015, African Americans in Political Participation, which was published in 2003, Black Political Mobilization, Leadership and Power, which came out in 1987, Housing and Urban Poor in Africa, which was published in 1982, and Ethnicity and Political Integration, which also was published in 1982. He has a number of articles and reviews that have appeared in a wide range of journals, including Polity, Comparative Political Studies, Publius, Comparative Politics, the Political Science Quarterly, International Political Science Review, and of course the National Political Science Review, as well as APSR, Politics and Religion, and the Journal of Modern African Studies. Dr. Morrison has been president of both NCOPS and the African Association of Political Science, US, and has served in many capacities with APSA and APSR. So, as you can see, we do indeed have an all-star panel, and we are in for a wonderful treat, and I think the perfect way to close out the conference. So we will turn now to Dr. Belk, followed by Dr. Frazier, followed by Dr. Laird, and we will bring it home with Dr. Morrison.
Thank you, Don, for a warm introduction, and I apologize to everyone in advance if you hear children and or dogs. It's that kind of time. So where do we go from here? Chaos or community? That question has haunted the United States since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in Memphis in 1968. To the United States, or the United States basically says to Black folk and other minoritized people, why are we still having this conversation? Why are we still having panels like this? Why haven't we done enough for you people? How long are you people going to complain? How much do you people need? My ancestors came here with nothing and built something from the ground up. Why can't you? Why are you still a problem? And that's always been the real question. How does it feel to be a problem? Posed by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903. This is an old attitude and it's a dangerous attitude. In The Colorline Belts the World, Du Bois said in 1906, most Americans are simply tired and impatient over our most sinister social problem, the Negro. They do not want to solve it. They do not want to understand it. They simply want to be done with it and hear the last of it. Of all possible attitudes, this is the most dangerous. We've learned that this attitude is widespread even today. According to analysis from the Pew Research Center, although nearly 9 in 10 Black Americans, 86%, say that the country has not made enough progress when it comes to the rights of Black people and Black people attaining equal rights with their white counterparts, only 39% of white respondents felt the same way, a 47 percentage point gap. That number for Latinx folk was 57%, for Asian and Pacific Islanders, 56%. Again, why are we still having panels like this? Why are we still here? Why are you still a problem? For many, this moment started with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota on May 25th, 2020. A 17-year-old Black girl recorded the footage of his death. We watched for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as Officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on Floyd's neck and his life left his body. Floyd called out for his deceased mother as he laid in the streets. Floyd's death, coming after the killings of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia and Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, sparked massive protests. Demonstrations took place in at least 1,700 places in all 50 states and in major cities around the world. They continued for weeks and then months. These were the largest sustained protests in the United States since the 1960s. They were more racially and ethnically diverse than those of yesteryear, as people of many different backgrounds took to the streets calling for justice in the face of police brutality. Statements of support flooded in from a wide variety of industries and institutions, public and private. Some said Black Lives Matter, while others did not. Still, the common idea was that people recognized something was wrong and that they wanted to speak out against it, or at least felt pressured to do so. But again, why are we still having panels like this? Why are we still here? Why are you still a problem? I think the answer is pretty straightforward. More people have been beaten and killed since George Floyd. The brutality has not stopped, even if some evidence suggests that it slowed following the demonstrations. Discrimination has not stopped. And to some, all of this has become a joke. On February 13, 2021, the Los Angeles Times reported that the Los Angeles PD launched an investigation after an officer reported that a photo of George Floyd with the words, "You take my breath away," was circulated in a Valentine-like format to other officers. And so that is why we are still here. That is why we are still having these conversations, because the problem is still here. Black and brown people are not the problem. The triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism domestically and internationally are the problem. They cost us dearly. Life, liberty, justice, human potential, lost economic opportunities, so on and so forth. According to King, each is a form of violence that exists in a vicious cycle. They are interrelated, all-inclusive, and stand as barriers to living in the beloved community. They stand in the way of achieving freedom, justice, equality, and peace. And that is what we are up against. Moreover, we are dealing with more than hearts and minds here. We are dealing with systems, interlocking systems of oppression that preserve or worsen inequality. These systems are resistant, hostile to change. We see evidence of their effectiveness everywhere. There are continued patterns of segregation in housing and education, unequal educational and economic opportunity, gaps in home ownership rates, gaps in workforce participation rates, low wages and lack of a living wage, a reinvigorated effort for Black voter suppression, unequal access to healthcare and access to low quality healthcare, extraordinarily punitive criminal justice policies and practices, as well as things like environmental racism. The list goes on. And so the question we were posed, well, what will we see in the near future? And history doesn't repeat itself, but it most certainly rhymes. And so it feels like we've been here before. In 2003, Ron Walters defined white nationalism as that radical faction of the American conservative movement that seeks to sustain white advantage by subordinating racialized peoples. White nationalists are those people or associations that knowingly or unknowingly advocate for policies that inflict harm upon communities of color. Walters further elucidated that white nationalist movements tend to emerge when white racial resentment, triggered by increased competition from people of color, combines with economic stagnation. And so we see that there are some dominant tendencies with white nationalist movements, that this radicalized conservative mobilization is associated with a heightened racial consciousness, feelings of alienation from government, a sense of power deflation, and vulnerability. These movements are typically organized by figures promising to oppose the coming encroachment and to restore whites to their superordinate status in the American racial order. Once empowered, such uprisings use their authority not only against the state, but against the presumed clients of the state who are perceived to constitute the, quote, offending culture, unquote. We are living through such a moment right now. Our ancestors and elders have lived through such moments in the past. The civil rights movement of the 19th century, Reconstruction, was overthrown by white nationalists. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century was thwarted by white nationalists. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 immediately gave rise to the Tea Party movement in early 2009. Black Lives Matter has been opposed by Unite the Right, the Proud Boys, and Blue Lives Matter. The most recent white radical movement provided a public space for Donald Trump to become a political figure. And we know how that's worked out. Walters further taught us that white nationalism produces policy racism. That is, white nationalist movements created an ideology which has had a decisive impact upon the political system, producing elected and appointed officials as policymakers who utilize this ideology to foment institutional racism within the courts, legislative bodies, and executive bodies. The Brennan Center for Justice notes that in just recent months, lawmakers across the states have introduced 253 bills with provisions that would restrict access to voting. We've seen this in about 43 states. These include restrictions on mail-in voting, barriers to completing or casting ballots, burdensome signature and matching requirements, strict voter ID requirements, and more aggressive and punitive voter purging practices. So in short, stakes is high. We know what we're up against. So where do we go from here, chaos or community? I think we've seen what chaos looks like. A pandemic that has claimed over 500,000 souls, and it's had a disparate impact on institutionally underserved communities, an uprising in the face of continued police brutality, arguably the most intense, bitter presidential election since 1876, and an attack on the nation's capital on January 6, 2021, where people who on one hand were proclaiming Blue Lives Matter and voicing tremendous support for law enforcement beat law enforcement officers with the American flag and were chanting F the police like they were at an NWA concert. So how do we go forward? In some ways, to me, the new plan seems to be the old plan because the old plan was never fulfilled. The idea was to make a better world and to attain universal freedom for all. I wrote this in the forthcoming project that was mentioned by Don, a project that I've been working on with Dr. Lakita Bennett Bailey at Georgia State University. At the height of the civil rights movement, the platform for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom demanded equal accommodations, withholding federal dollars from discriminatory programs, jobs for the unemployed, and a living wage. In 1966, the Black Panther Party 10-point program called for, among other things, full employment, vastly improved housing and education, an end to police brutality, an end to mass imprisonment, and justice and peace. In 1972, the National Black Political Convention brought together a large and ideologically diverse group of organizers, elected officials, religious leaders, and intellectuals to formulate a unified Black agenda to better the Black condition. Convention goers were also implored to seek public office. In 1977, the queer Black feminists of the Combahee River Collective championed an integrated analysis and practice to dismantle interlocking systems of oppression. More recently, the Black Lives Matter Global Network, founded by 3 Black women organizers, 2 of whom are queer, forged a platform that incorporated these elements into its own, especially demanding for an end to state-sanctioned violence against Black people. Furthermore, the Movement for Black Lives, organized in December 2014, envisioned or declared an emphatic vision that was abolitionist, anti-capitalist, and pro-reparations. And so King, in arguing for a beloved community, stood against the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And he noted that in the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness would not be tolerated because of international standards of human decency would not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice would be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, international disputes would be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution rather than military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. From my vantage point, public policy and private practices help to create or worsen these conditions, and those certainly have to be part of the solution. And so when I think about where we go from here, I look back to that recent history of the big movements of the mid-20th century, because except for the desegregation of public facilities and such, a lot of that work simply was not done or undermined by those seeking to preserve white advantage at the expense of everything else. And I think that it's that sort of action that gives us an opportunity to move forward. But I also want to echo something that Brother Lester Spence said earlier in a talk, that, you know, sometimes if people are going to kick you and keep kicking you and keep kicking you, you have to break the foot and there'll be no more kicking. That you work with people who display a genuine interest and a commitment in solving problems. But with those who have demonstrated time and time again that they are against you in every way, shape, or form, you have to find ways to work around or through them because they're not interested in moving forward with this democratic enterprise in the way that we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Adolphus, for those stirring comments and thoughtful analysis. Next, we turn to Dr. Lori Frazier.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me well, Don? Use thumbs up, Adolphus. Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. I want to first thank INCOPES for allowing me to share this space with you today and offer some comments on where do we go from here, possibilities and challenges for Black politics. First, I want to thank the past president, Sekou Franklin, and the current president, Tiffany Willoughby Harold, for her amazing address. And I look so forward to working with her during this year and serving as 2 folks on the West Coast. I wanted to thank Executive Kathy Strohmeyer Golden, as well as the planning committee, Don, Ali, and Gladys, who did an amazing job in uplifting virtual meeting. Thank you so much for all of your service. Sekou also did a great job all year long with his town halls, including so many voices of folks, Black scholars, leaders, activists, and policymakers through his town halls, and those were outstanding for the community. It's imperative before my comments that I note wherever I can, whenever I can, that it is because of NCOPES that I'm here today. And I continue to introduce my students to the NCOPES family, just like my mentors, Diane Penderhughes and Todd Shaw, brought me to NCOPES for the first time when I was a 19-year-old undergrad at University of Illinois. So their mentorship changed my life and trajectory, and they introduced to me the possibilities and challenges for the study of Black politics through their Black politics courses at the University of Illinois. So my comments today reflect on the excellence of Black people, Black scholarship, and the study of Black politics as we continue to march and persevere towards democracy's promise. So I was reflecting on democracy's promise and all of its unfinished business, full of contradictions that were once again on full display for the world to witness during the month of January. Yes, like you, we were ready to put 2020 in the rearview mirror, but the first 3 weeks of 2021 seemingly bookends for democracy's peril and democracy's promise. The J6 insurrection at the Capitol was the outgrowth and enduring part of America's history of white supremacy and violence. The night before the insurrection, we celebrated the election of Raphael Warnock as he was declared the winner of the Georgia runoff Senate race and will become the first Black senator in Georgia. Then, as the nation's capital was being overrun by Trump supporters, including racist white nationalists and their sympathizers, we got the word that Jon Ossoff would be sworn in as the first Jewish senator from Georgia. I felt disgusted to my core watching the footage, but not at all surprised. I thought about the Black people across the country and the globe, and right here in Los Angeles, including our sister Melina Abdullah and the Black Lives Matter movement in LA, who put their lives on the line time after time, showing unimaginable courage, grace, and deep love. I think about all the folks around the country who are also protesting during a pandemic, taking to the streets peacefully, who were met with threat, intimidation, and violence in an effort to basically uplift basic humanity and dignity for folks to breathe, run, walk, laugh, eat, basic humanity. We have seen firsthand how the pandemic has exacerbated already pre-existing conditions of economic and racial inequalities related to health disparities, income, education, housing, and other social vulnerabilities, with the Black community being hit among the most hard. The pandemic continues to expose persistence of racism, nativism, xenophobia, and discrimination in the US. The past election season also laid bare the implications of the pandemic on the stability of our democratic institutions, on democracy's promise, particularly related to in-person voting, which has been so much a part of the fabric of the life of voting for Blacks in the US. But I wanted to note that these challenges for Black people have always been the door to possibilities. The presidential election year was also the commemoration of the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Black voters hold a long history of grassroots organizing and get out the vote forms of voter mobilization. And we saw some of these modes being slowed dramatically because of the pandemic, but also because of fear and intimidation, like Souls to the Polls, for which in many places were not stopped completely, but definitely slowed in terms of their impact and what they were able to do given the pandemic. While Black voters are highly engaged in the political process, Black voters are also more likely to Black voters during the general election were also more likely in surveys to feel that their vote would be suppressed if they would mail it in, if they would mail in their ballot, and that there would be also trouble at the polls, threat at the polls, particularly when the president was telling folks on national television and international television to stand back and stand by. Millions of African Americans used absentee ballots for the very first time. And this is not a practice that has been cultivated in the same way as standing online to early vote, so to the polls and other kinds of mechanisms, or to vote on election day. So this is a conundrum, and this continues to be a conundrum, where consistently over 90% of the Democratic Party support of African Americans support the Democratic Party at well over 90% in presidential elections. But study after study and report after report showed that mail-in ballots were more likely to be rejected than in-person ballots. And research has shown that first-time voters and minority voters are all much more likely to have had their ballots rejected. So millions of voters could have mailed in their ballots. However, during a pandemic, they put their lives on the line to stand online and vote in person. And the data shows that Black people were concerned consistently about suppression and a high distrust of American institutions like the post office, and thus decided to vote in person. So this raised some questions about what we learned from 2016. In 2016, Black voter turnout declined for the first time in 20 years in a presidential election, falling from 59.6% in 2016 after reaching a record high of 66% in 2012. And if Black voters turned out at all, they would overwhelmingly choose a Democrat, but with little attention to cycles of undermobilization of Black voters. So here we must turn to political scientists such as Ishmael White and Cheryl Laird and their book, Steadfast Democrats, as well as so many other Black political scientists who have pointed out some of the implications of undermobilization of the Democratic Party and just party politics in general. White and Laird point out that Democratic partisanship has become significantly tied to Black identity in the United States, that Black turnout levels returned in 2016 to the levels of 2004. So this drop in voter turnout narrative in the media did little to shine a light on cycles of undermobilization. And so when 2016 levels returned to 2004 or pre-Obama levels, it suggests that what fell off was the Black community's incentive to deliver their full voting potential. But we have done it before, and we've done it again in 2020. How did we take that on? Well, we also have a long history of Black freedom fighters, past and present, who chose community over chaos, particularly those Black women who showed up. And I'm going to give some examples here that we all are well aware of. But I wanted to turn my attention to Stacey Abrams' relentless push for justice and democracy as an example of how, in the face of uncertainty and defeat, how she turned a rejection, or what some would see as rejection, into a redirection that saved American democracy. So Stacey Abrams won the Democratic nomination in Georgia for the gubernatorial Democratic nomination, making her the first Black woman in the US to be a major party's nominee for governor. However, the hotly contested race, she lost to Brian Kemp. And so let me just pause here and note that during this race, Black women supported Abrams at 97% over Kemp at 2%. Black men supported Abrams at 88% over Kemp at 11%. White women supported Kemp at 75% over Abrams at 25%. And white men supported Kemp at 73% over Abrams at 25%. So for Abrams, despite voter suppression, disinformation, and disenfranchisement of Georgia voters, she did not sit down. She did not sort of look at the past and say, well, I'm not sure what Blacks are going to do here. Are we going to turn out to vote? Are we going to, just have a continuation of our rights being trampled on? So again, given the long historical context of organizing that Abrams has, she founded Fair Fight. And so again, there is for a long time, we'll be studying how the community organizing of Fair Fight, as well as other nonprofits in Georgia and elsewhere, helped us to secure the election in Georgia, not just for the presidential election, but the 2 runoff races. So what happened in Georgia and how Georgia saved American democracy has to be looked at in the context of the role of gender, race, class, power, sexism, and racism, led at the hands of Black women. Black women are often called the backbone, the stalwarts of the Democratic Party, with the media, as well as many political leaders after securing election, say, thank you, Black women, right? But we also have to better understand and continue to push the understanding in Black politics and beyond about the partisan gender gap between male and female voters. The partisan gender gap is still driven by the historical patterns and legacies of women of color voters, particularly Black women, in support of the Democratic Party candidate. And in 2020, after all that we've been through, white women still voted in the majorities for Trump. And Black women, again, stepped up across the country, voting in the vast majorities, over 90% for the Democratic Party candidate. So I just wanted to turn our attention now in my final few moments to where do we go from here? In 2020's election, over 140 women will now serve in the 117th Congress. At least 115 women of color ran for Congress in 2020. A record-breaking over 50 women of color were serving Congress with bipartisan gains in that regard, but the vast majority of them on the Democratic Party side. And of course, we celebrate and reflect on the election of Vice President Harris, the first Black, South Asian, historically Black college graduate, member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated to hold this office. As Niambi Carter noted in a Washington Post article, I believe on the day of the inauguration, there's a whole lot of firsts here, and with a whole lot of firsts comes a whole lot of attention and scrutiny. Kamala Harris would be the most powerful vice president in years and the most powerful Black or Asian woman in American history. And with that power granted to her by the hard work of Black women, as Niambi Carter points out, will also mean that she will preside over the Senate and will be likely called upon to break ties in the Senate on a more regular basis than her predecessors. And we can really gear up. We can see, even with the more recent fights, that we can gear up for that battle. So as we reflect on and persevere and get moving forward, one thing that I've noticed very quickly is that political scientists, activists, organizers, and other leaders are not slowing down on the well knowledge that you have 2 short years before the midterm elections. And in these 2 short years, we could lose like we did after we waited, we celebrated perhaps a little bit too long, all the nostalgia over the 2008 election of the first Black president in the United States. And so we have 2 short years where we could lose the executive branch, the House and the Senate. And so I see it particularly for scholars and activists and community organizers on the ground are getting organized well to put pressure on the Biden-Harris administration for lasting change and not to sit around waiting for cooperation, given the depth of opposition and the depth of racism that we see continue to be laid bare. So I wanted to also remind us, as I close, that what is on the agenda for Black Americans is ever more consequential, but even more difficult to garner as we now move from a political coalition, which was historic in its nature, very diverse across gender, race, class lines. But as we move to now a governing coalition, we look at what's on the table, racial equity in terms of the Biden-Harris administration's immediate priorities, but also a list of COVID, climate, economy, healthcare, immigration, and so many other issues on the table. And so in terms of fulfilling that democracy's promise, will it be a dream deferred for African Americans, for Black women who fought so hard for these gains? And so I want to challenge you to turn our attention as Black political scientists to sort of thinking about all of the rich scholarship in our past on governing coalitions, moving from political coalitions to governing coalitions, and what that means for this historic Biden-Harris administration, but particularly as we move towards positioning the interests of Black Americans and Black women and Black families during this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori, for another compelling, thought-provoking perspective on where we are. We now turn to Dr. Laird.
Thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen to make sure. Can everybody see that? Yes? Can people see this? Okay, great. All right, so in thinking about everything that's been talked about already, and I think Professor Belk and Professor Fraser have already touched on so many of the points that I plan to speak on today. And it's a very exciting time and also, thoughtful time that we're having now in thinking about where we go and the challenges that we face in Black politics. And so I'm going to talk about 3 points today. And again, some of them have been touched upon, but I think re-emphasizing them just speaks to why they are so important and so vital for us to keep considering, thinking about, doing research upon, and investigating to understand the role of African Americans going forward in our politics, and one that has a long history. And so first is going to be with respect to partisanship. And it's going to be building off of some of the work that I did with Ishmael White in our book, Steadfast Democrats, where here we did an investigation to understand the dynamics of partisanship, and particularly try to think about the ways in which the social dynamics within the Black community really tend to shape the way we politically engage. And that this tends to occur even as we see variation increasing within the African American community on key variables and key indicators that would seem to say that individuals would be more likely to decide to vote for other parties, vote for the Republican Party, or vote independently, or vote for the Green Party, rather than voting for the Democratic Party. So one way we can look at this is through income distribution, and we can see that mean Black household income has increased in variation over time. Obviously, everything that's been going on with COVID and the economic challenges that have been now going to be facing the African American community are things to be thinking about going forward, and how we might even see these trends clearly show distinctions as a result of the COVID crisis. Additionally, we see variation in the types of ideological perspectives of African Americans. And again, I think this is important to note too, because frequently the Black community we are seen as this monolith, that we don't seem to have varying views and opinions, varying perspectives and thoughts, that we aren't coming from different lenses on how we are seeing the political world, when in fact that we are. And I think that that's an important piece to note too foundationally, because then when we observe democratic partisanship and the behavior that we see the Black community do in our politics, that is not something that is being done in jest. It is not something that is being done in haste. It is not something being done without thought. It is being done with significant agency and strategy as a group, trying to basically be able to leverage themselves as a collective. And so what we think about here then is also, and this is noted too as well by Dr. Fraser, how much identity and partisanship have become intertwined. And I think that that was one of the major findings that Ishmael and I had when we were working on this book, is just in our thinking about how much Black identity and partisanship have become intertwined, where to be Black has basically and essentially also become to be Democrat. And to the point that this norm has become so codified within the African American community, we even see things like in pop culture. Here is Andre from the show Blackish, on an episode that they dedicated to understanding partisanship in Black Republican, partisanship in their family, with their son potentially being a member of the Black Republican organization at the school. And Dre specifically noting too the idea that, look, you can do anything, but you can't be a Black Republican, right? And so again, although there are Black Republicans and those who are even conservative, ideological and leaning, the decision to vote for the Democratic Party in mass that we see being done by African Americans is one that is based on a strategic thinking that is going on, and one in an attempt to leverage power within the collective system. And that this dynamic is one that is socially defined. And so in the book, we ask this question, of how have Blacks maintained Democratic Party unity over the last 50 years. And although many of the arguments that we've had around this has stemmed and primarily focused on linked fate, which is still a very important measure, and I'm continuing to do even more work in myself on trying to kind of pull apart and really pin down some of the pieces of how linked fate operates, building off of the work from Dawson and his seminal piece Behind the Mule. But we also wanted to think about the maintenance of Democratic Party unity, and linked fate was not necessarily providing us with that type of understanding. And what we really wanted to bring into bear is the way in which the social really plays a role. And so we argue in the book that Black partisanship is maintained through Black social networks, right? And so when we think about partisanship, and there's other work, we think more about communities like the white community. I think of work from Uncivil Agreement by Liliana Mason, other individuals who have looked at the partisan dynamics within the white community. But in the Black community, there's something very unique that goes on. And Ishmael and I really enjoyed interrogating this. And I think it speaks more to the future as well of what we can see from the African American community in our partisan politics. So what we argue in the book is this concept known as racialized social constraint. And we say that it is a process enforcing the norms of Black political behavior, and it includes a well-defined, racially specific social reward and penalty, which are used to compel compliance with the group-based expectations of political behavior. All of that basically to say that this is a norm that has become enforced within the group. It is one that has been building off of the history of collectivizing and collective behavior by the group, one in which a clear understanding of prioritizing the group interests is something that is socialized and understood within the community, and that is rewarded for those who do it at the extreme levels. And so people like John Lewis, and we think of Martin Luther King, and we think of other individuals who really sacrifice self for the interest of the group, and also those who are penalized for seeming to put the group interests at threat, right? And so compliance here is basically something that is able to be maintained through this social dynamic. And much of this stems again from the historical things that have gone on and the shared historical experiences of African Americans with respect to something like segregation. But and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but when we think about even the social belonging for African Americans, the ongoing importance of social belonging within the Black community and the primacy of other Blacks in social ties that bind provides a unique leverage for politics focused on the group interest. So this idea of social belonging, which I think dovetails quite nicely with this conference that we are at, with the tradition of what NCOPES embodies, where social belonging and the need to be social with one another and to thinking about the group interest is at the foundation of our politics and the foundation of our organization, and I think speaks to the future of what Black politics will look like going forward. When we also take into consideration the maintenance of this partisan behavior, which from the perspective of where Ishmael and I come from on this, I think that we have a very minimal likelihood in seeing the weathering of this partisan dynamic, in part because it is maintained through an entity that we didn't necessarily create, which is residential racial segregation, which leads to these social interactions that are disproportionately African American when it comes to Black individuals. So this is just from some of the data analysis that we found. And also, although white individuals find themselves in social relationships with other white people, the likelihood that there is more partisan diversity within their social space is much more likely than it is for African Americans. Additionally, when we think about the touch points day to day that Black individuals have with other Black people, most African Americans are having a high amount of touch points with other Blacks due to the residential segregation that has very much defined the lived experiences of African Americans. And we can think about that even further. Recently I heard Charles Blow speak about his most recent book that he wrote, where he's making an argument about the movement of Blacks back into the southern region of the United States. And we've been reading about this even before his writings about the second migration. But what does it mean when the collective is able to have such a strong norm and practice of behavior, a clear norm that, as we saw in 2020, led to outcomes that the group desired, that also then may be able to leverage its collective power in spaces and places where once they had been in large number and now are returning back in large number again, right? And so what does that mean then for the future of our politics? And I particularly think it's going to be significant because really the decline that we would argue for the maintenance of this partisanship behavior, although we've seen the decline of certain institutions within the Black community, the way in which we engage in our social contact, one would essentially need to end racial segregation in order to really put a crack into the norm that has so long defined the collective behavior of the community. The second thing of importance that I think to think about going forward, again, and noted too again by Dr. Fraser, is Black women. Black women have played such an essential role in our politics over time. We think back to even points in history where African American women were not necessarily able to participate in the franchise. We still see them doing the collective work and the behind the scenes work, the front of the line work, doing avenues in various places, serving as bridge builders, as some writings have talked about, change agents that have been written about in other works, including the works from Evelyn Simeon and other scholars, and Melissa Harris Perry on Black women. And 2020 was no different, where we saw headline after headline after headline talking about the role that Black women played within that election and the role that they played in the Democratic Party specifically. So when the Democratic Party is now thinking about who is the backbone, who is the foundation of the party, if they are not thinking about Black women, they would be sadly mistaken, right? And even the work that they did that has been done by Black women has even been diminished by those who see themselves as allies, right? So I thought about Eva Longoria having to apologize for a comment. She's activist and actress, trying to erase the image of Black women and the way in which Black women helped with the Biden victory, basically making it happen. And I think historically, this is what we've often seen of the role that Black women have played in our politics, is that although they are there doing the work and doing the work to a degree that exceeds that of many other racial and gender groups, they often are ignored for what they have offered and provided, but they, in my mind, serve as the pieces of the puzzle of what we can see in Black politics going forward. When we even look at other organizations that have talked about the role of women of color broadly, women of color have going to be playing a central role in engaging with and mobilizing others to participate. And so this is from the Center of American Progress, and they argue that these factors suggest that women of color voters will play a critical role in upcoming elections. And so one thing in that I also think is key to think about is that with women of color, and particularly with Black women, the ability for them to participate in politics is one that not only do they not take for granted, but they make sure to bring others with them. And so in not just one of them voting, but it is 5 to 10 other individuals, even hundreds and thousands if we think of it at higher levels of like Stacey Abrams, as well as LaTosha Brown, and the work with those organizations on the ground, the grassroots organizing. And so women of color really need to be a focus and something that within our research and our scholarship that we continue to delve into. And I am even working on work with Julian Womble at George Washington University, where we're really trying to understand how this intersectionality and the lived experiences of Black women are, one, informed, and two, how that then informs their political thinking. And this again is key when we look at the changing demographics of the electorate. And this is something that has been talked about time and time again about the increasing majority minority population coming by 2050. But additionally, if we look at the electorate and eligible voters, we can see from research from the Pew Center that the numbers indicate that Hispanic, Black, and Asian populations are going to be some of our largest gains within the electorate. And that, again, here, I think Black women and women of color will be the leaders within that space to help those electorates understand, shape, define, and engage with the political space. Further, and my last thought is basically the consideration of things like voting rights. And when I teach on voting rights and talk about the battles and the fights that we have seen throughout African American history for this access, Fannie Lou Hamer is never that far from my mind. It is one of the critical things that I have my students learn about. And I think is someone and a stalwart of just an example of how much Black women and people within the community have been committed to ensuring the protections and the voting rights that are there, maintain themselves, and even challenging systems that seem to deny us access. And so we see now numerous court cases, various pieces of legislation coming out in state legislatures, trying to diminish the likelihood that people will be able to participate in a free franchise. So we have one of the most, what is considered the freest election that we've ever had in the history of the United States. And immediately after that, numerous legislatures putting out policy, putting out legislation, indicating that they're going to do things like diminish the access to early voting, diminish access to absentee ballots, diminish access to even having reasons for why one might be able to use absentee ballots. We still have the gutting of the Voting Rights Act with the preclearance pieces of that has still not been rectified since the Supreme Court decision of Shelby v. Holder. And Congress sitting with H.R. 1, Democracy Reform Will, with an attempt to try to address the right to vote and ensuring same-day registration, automatic voter registration, and outlawing voter purging. But even then, there have been those who've been arguing in the activist world that this is not necessarily going to be enough to do the protections that are necessary to ensure that everybody's able to engage within the franchise. So I think going forward, it's almost like, we're seeing a lot of our history repeat itself, and in various ways we find ourselves having to fight some of the same fights. But I think that as a community and as an organization, even as NCOPES, we are ready for the progress to go forward. And we are in a position now to really have understandings and our lived experiences as a community and the ways in which we have understood our politics is one that I think puts us at a major advantage to fight these battles, and puts us in a position to really have guidance and thoughtfulness in what we are going to be pursuing going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Laird, for another insightful and really thoughtful presentation, really clarifying some things for us that we may not, kind of put all together in one picture. Thank you. We now turn to Dr. Morrison.
All right. Thank you very much. I am going to also share my screen because I have some notes. But let me begin, first of all, by saying to Sekou and to Tiffany, I honor you. And to Kathy, you have my heart. I want to make 3 points that are suggestions really for discussion that are framed around the question of what is the future of Black politics going from this moment. And what I mean by that is full exercise of citizenship rights and representation in the USA. And the 3 points are built around bad news, same news, and good news. I should tell you that there is nothing I'm going to say here that's new. My panelists have mentioned some of all the things that I wanted to comment on. By bad news, I mean that I expect a part of this future to be an escalation of a virulent white tribalism. Same news is status quo bargaining in liberal democratic politics. And good news is the sustained realm of vigilant opposition that African Americans have always engaged in this country. So what do I mean by the bad news? I expect that the future of Black politics is going to see a magnified racism and efforts to sustain white supremacy. In part, this is a continuity of the racialized society that we've lived in since we were brought to these shores. It has been ramped up in what I call a post-Obama effect, which just seemed to excite white tribalism. And there were 2 important elements of this that I want to call to your attention. They've already been mentioned. One is voter suppression. We are in a time when the white supremacists are outwardly, including the standard bearer for one of the major parties, arguing that participation of citizens in a democracy that is defined by it should be suppressed. And parallel to that is gerrymandering of districts, the very means by which representation is defined and participation is executed. So this bad news is that I expect that there will be a willingness, we're already seeing it, to abandon all pretense of democracy, even rationality, to maintain power and cultural supremacy. What is the same news? This is about status quo liberal democratic politics in which African Americans have made some gains in the political system. So I am suggesting that this will be a part of the future as well, a kind of minority political bidding, what Haynes Walton has identified as Black one-party politics. Cheryl has just made this argument very clear, the point I'm making here about Democratic Party identification on the part of African Americans. It's most symbolized now by a woman, which is the embodiment of all the important things about the special role that women have played in electoral politics since about the 1970s, when that became a major means by which participation was exercised. We should all be aware that despite the fact that this same news will be one of the means by which we will participate, there are certain kinds of limits to it. The undemocratic nature of the Senate by design has never been sorted since that original compromise. Another problem is the 50+1 rule that negates a minority rights principle when there is a stable minority population that's stably underrepresented by as African Americans are. The Electoral College serving as a filter to diminish the importance of the one person, one vote principle. And in this moment, a thoroughly compromised judiciary, the branch that supports conflicts in our status in the political community where we exist in a contested status in reference to a public policy. Despite those limits, I think there are interesting things that can be said about what may be a moment in regard to the standard two-party system in the USA. Now we can raise a fundamental question of whether it is inevitable that we're going to have a two-party system forever, and what the meanings of that may be for African Americans. I don't actually know the answer to this, but I do know what some of the questions are. One is, does Republican Party extremism lead to a one-party dominant two-party system? The Democratic Party, with which African Americans are identified at this moment, what would be the implications of a situation like that is an important question about the future. Another one is whether this is in fact the end of two-party dominance in the USA, where the Republican Party will split into two or more factions and will build the opportunity for the first time in the history of this country for a sustained period of time that we will have multi-faction coalition building. What would be the consequences of that for the ways in which African Americans would bid in a kind of status quo liberal democratic politics? Now we come to the good news story, and that is that it is my expectation in the future, and this is more than a hope, because we've always done it. We've always existed in this country in opposition to white supremacy, in opposition to the ways in which the structures of the political system have made us outsiders. And that is the necessity of resistance to relentless white oppression in the US political system. Without our opposition, we've made no gains here. And there are lots of progeny. These are some of the names of those who are important models of opposition, the men and women who have provided for us marvelous examples. And I'm happy to say that in this moment, I expect that this opposition will not just continue, but will be ramped up. And looking at three examples that I'd just like to mention to you for the possibility of discussion about those who are accepting this mantle for an extended opposition to white supremacy. Our own organization, INCOPES, an enduring singular quest of race scholarship and activism, and it does not seem to be waning. In my estimation, what I've seen in the last several years is that INCOPES is becoming stronger, better projecting itself for this singular quest of race scholarship and activism. A grassroots political organization, Black Lives Matter, is another example. Stacey Abrams' organization in Atlanta has already been mentioned as an example of these efforts on the ground that I expect will continue to figure into this oppositional realm in which African Americans existed. And perhaps you have not been noticing, but there is what I call a new NAACP under the leadership of Derek Johnson, a young man who has assumed the mantle in that organization and is raising very important questions, situating this organization again, I think, in a major place as an oppositional force in the effort to remove white supremacy. Why is this such good news for the future of Black politics? It is because it is only in this realm where we have ever made changes to the structure of the political system in which we have to exist. Sister Beatty said the other night, she exists because there is an opposition place that propels her to a position in Congress. So without this space, this place, there is no change in the system. As Frederick Douglass said, this is the place where we take power, where we take those things we acquire to get some of our own in this political system. So I will end by saying that I think there is a wonderful convergence for this future in spite of the bad news. There is a way in which the good news and the same news come together as effective tools, necessary tools for any political gains we're going to make, so long as we exist within this political structure. Mind you, I am aware that I might well have made this conversation about what the future would be like outside of the USA as a policy, but the topic I was given to talk about the future of politics in the USA. And so I think there is this wonderful convergence between this oppositional place that propels those into positions in a structural system that by design is meant to exclude us, that allows for the eking out of positions of power and difference in reference to our welfare interests. I think Congresswoman Beatty and the 2021 INCOPES theme combine to make this point eloquently. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison, for a powerful presentation. And again, clarifying for us kind of where we are and where we might be going. I'm going to pose a question to our panelists. And it's going to be a long question, but it's actually a simple question. So the title of this panel, Where Do We Go From Here, of course, was inspired by Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Community or chaos, right? And so I've been thinking about these dualities, like these competing notions of either divergent paths or maybe divergent destinies, right? That's why I'm thinking chaos or community, possibilities or challenges. And in myself, I've been trying to decide whether I'm going to be optimistic or pessimistic, right? Looking back at the most recent developments, when I look internally amongst Black people in the United States, but even beyond that, but amongst Black people, I'm optimistic, right? In the most recent election, I was very optimistic in terms of the mobilization, the effort, the commitment that people displayed to try to assert themselves politically, that Black people displayed. On election day, we went to Philadelphia, battleground state. We're in Maryland. We went to Philadelphia to try to do some door knocking and things like that. I was fascinated by the fact that we didn't really have to knock on any doors. Everybody was already out. They already voted. You know, I mean, folks. There were only a couple people who said they didn't, and they were like, oh, "I'm on my way to go vote." You know, and we were in West Philly. We weren't in. We were in West Philly, in the real community, right? And so it was striking and inspiring. And then we see what happened across the country in terms of the election, and so those are grounds for optimism. Optimistic about the mobilization and the protests, etc. Optimistic about the array of folks who joined in with the protest movement in the last year, right? Folks who weren't necessarily on that path joined in. So I'm very optimistic about that. But then I'm pessimistic, right, about the broader political environment and the broader political landscape. As you all have described, white nationalism or white tribalism, which is probably a better term for it, is ascendant. We have, the persistent challenges that have existed, right? And throughout this conference, folks have pointed to capitalism and the nature and structures of capitalism in terms of what that means and the functioning of it. And as some folks talk, the neoliberal turn of the Lester was talking about so eloquently yesterday. And so the external is leading me to a level of pessimism. So I'm going to ask you guys to help me to decide whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. Are those optimistic elements internal that we can see sufficient to withstand and transform the external environment? And if so, how? So the easy part is to say yes, no, but how? If you're going to say yes, you got to tell me how. How is it we can get from where we are, given all that's arrayed around us? So before I turn the question over, let me tell you a quick 30-second story. My father's had a first cousin, Cleveland Robinson, who was the coordinator, the chair of the March on Washington, big union leader in New York City. And he was heavily involved in the civil rights movement. So I would always, every time I come across something with Martin Luther King, I try to see if he's talking to Cleveland Robinson about certain things. So I found a letter from Cleveland Robinson to Martin Luther King, like 1965. And he was positive about the progress that they'd been making in the civil rights movement. But he said, now we need to start talking about these other more difficult issues of economics and the economic well-being, right? And he said, but when we start talking about these things, a lot of our friends are no longer going to be our friends. A lot of our friends are not going to stand with us. It's the same argument, of course, that Rustin makes from protest to politics. But I was struck by that Cleveland Robinson was having that conversation with Martin Luther King, kind of a little earlier than I thought they were having that conversation when I saw the letter. But I was thinking about that lately, right? In this moment, when white tribalism, white nationalism is ascendant, right? In some ways, I feel like some of our we African Americans, African people of African descent might have to align with capitalists to fight against the nationalists, right? Or we can think of ourselves as being facing a coalition of opposition, capitalists, nationalists, populists, and who else, right? And so in that context, in that political context, right, should I be pessimistic? Where do we go from here? Can if you kind of look at the coalition against nationalism, that coalition might not withstand, you know, or be stable in the face of challenges to capitalism, right? Can our allies against nationalism be counted on to be allies against capitalist exploitation of Black communities and Black people? So that's what I'm getting kind of pessimistic about, right? So I don't know. So I'm turning it back to you guys. Should I be optimistic or pessimistic, or what's likely to happen? If I should be optimistic, how can I be in this current, under these current conditions?
Well, that's a pretty heavy duty challenge, because there were lots of things in what you asked. But let me just say something to you about the notion of pessimism or optimism. Some of you will know that I am a son of Mississippi. I was born and reared there. I was on the tail end of the movement there, and racism was so virulent in Mississippi that there wasn't world enough in time to think about pessimism or optimism. You just had to fight. And so I think this is one of those moments where the choices are so stark that there isn't world enough and time to be pessimistic, because that's when we die. That's when everything folds. But there has to be time to fight. So that oppositional realm I was talking about is that place where we have operated. That's a constant in our existence in the society and the political system. And that's the challenge, is to fight. And there isn't enough space to figure out whether that's good and bad. You just have to fight your way through to get some benefits and so on. The capitalism question, I'll leave to somebody else to respond to, because I don't want to take too much time. Yeah.
Thanks.
I would say that, because brother Naja Baptiste also asked in the group chat, is it too late to do this work, right? And echoing on Dr. Morrison's remark, you know, we have to fight because we're fighting for our survival. And when we think about this, I know that the two of my panelists are with me in having young children. I have a 6-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. And I think it's possible to have these feelings or sensations in the absence of the relationships that are forged through parenthood, right? So I'm not trying to be exclusive with this, but I'm just saying that for me, as an intellectual, as a person of the community, as a human being, this is part of what drives and animates me. If I give in to the despair that can come with pessimism as a space where you get stuck, then why did we do this? You know, today, you know, part of the reasons why my participation in NCOPES is sometimes sketchy, the conference always falls around my wedding anniversary. Today's my 11th wedding anniversary. We became parents almost 8 years ago. We have 2 children, that second child because of NCOPES, you know, funny story, but not for now. And if I give into that, what do I do with my babies? You know, what do I do with my children, right? Who I want to change this world. And I'm not so arrogant to think that all I'm going to do as a father is teach them. I am already learning from and growing with them. And so I have to believe in what my late dissertation advisor, Dr. Linda Faye Williams, said. I have to believe that we can make a better world, because if we don't, that's an alternative I just can't allow myself to consider. And the optimism for me comes in, as Brother Morrison said, I'm in South Carolina at a university with buildings named after virulent white supremacists, chief among them Benjamin Ryan Tillman. If you've ever seen an email from me, you know where I get down on this. And this is my ancestral home in South Carolina. My father's people are from here, and I can trace them back for generations in 2 census tracts in Lancaster County, South Carolina. The fact that I can be here, be the kind of professor that I am, be the kind of Black man that I am out loud and in public is a testament to the progress, right? And if that's possible, then all these other things that we dream and imagine are attainable.
Belk, I don't know how to come after that, because I think you just, everything that I feel. We have kids that are similar in age. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and my dad is from Tella, Arkansas, and he only had an 8th grade education. So everything he taught me and put inside of me to want to do this work around Black politics or Black scholarship or just being an academic. This is something that was so foreign to, anybody in my family to want to achieve this or be this or think about how to be this. And so again, I just want to tie this to Dr. Moore's comments and Dr. Belk's comments to that why our presence is so important, because at the same time we're pondering these questions about our world and how to make it a better place, like Dr. Linda Faye Williams would say to us all the time in her office, is that every move we make on our campus and in our work that we do in the community and in our writings, we are pondering all of these intersecting factors. But right here in our homes, especially this year, because we've had to wear so many additional hats, that I can't give up, because I have a 6-year-old who has a lot of questions, and I may not have all the answers, but I definitely want to keep pushing on. Or like my dad would tell me every time he got off the phone with me, keep on keeping on, Laura, keep on keeping on, right? But that's just something that was given where he came from, born in 1927. He persevered, he kept going. And even on the J6 insurrection, my parents have passed on, both of them, but I talking to my sisters on the phone back in Chicago, and we remind one another of the stories they told us, but what people have come through, and that none of the J6 insurrection surprised any of us. It was painful and hurtful, but we think we have these stories. We know what our ancestors have faced, and how we stand despite, right? And how we keep moving despite the pain and our soul just being tired. Everybody on this panel, 58 folks in the audience, your soul been tired this past year in ways unimaginable, right? We're just having to explain alone, people asking you random questions that you know. And so again, I show up for my daughter, but I also show up for my students who are also trying to disentangle. And that is a part of the strength I get from folks at NCOPES, even having the conversations with Don and, bothering him doing all the time that he's trying to plan the conference. But he's just, these connections that run deep. And that keeps me empowered to keep on keeping on in the face of everything that we see. And I'm out here because I feel an obligation to not sit down on what everybody else who've come before me have worked so hard to open up the doors for me. And now I get to open up the doors for my students, and then they're going to open up the doors for others. But one more thing I just wanted to note really quickly is for Black political scientists, it is that intersection of the work we're doing in our scholarship and at the local level, and that we're doing just in our household, and just in terms of making this world a better place. And all of those things are at the intersection that we can't give up. We just got to keep on keeping on.
Let me say one other thing that perhaps only I can say on this panel, and that is that my child is slightly older than the children of the other members of this panel. Your engagement in this moment comes back to you when you see what your children become in reflecting the values you've imparted to them. I mean, the wonder of seeing my daughter, who is slightly older than you guys' children, is the way in which she has, in some of the values that we attempted to inculcate, took root and is reflected or are reflected in the way she lives her life. So that is an important dimension of it too. Now it's a bit wearying because you've got to look at and try to protect them and so on. But they do grow up, and what you give, you get back.
I was trying to read through the comments. There's so many comments and they're so dense. There are no simple questions moving forward. But I appreciate all of your sentiments around the power and the necessity of struggling and fighting in these current conditions, right? If you all would take us from so we see the array of challenges. We know we've got to fight. Where do we go as Black political scientists into the future in terms of navigating these spaces? How do we practically engage the contemporary political and intellectual landscape in a way that can further our mission of improving the conditions and life chances of Black people in the US and around the world? How do we do that? What do you think? What do you think about how we do that individually and collectively moving forward? Do I have to call on people like I do in class?
I raised my hand. I didn't know the protocol. I'm so socialized to do this. I was thinking to myself about a couple of things. I mean, some of the points that were made before, and I think as Black political scientists, I don't know. I have been predominantly in PWI spaces for my career in this field, from the training I did at Maryland with Linda Williams and Ron Walters to where I am now at Bowdoin College, where I'm like in the whitest state in the nation. And I think in order for me, at one of the whitest colleges I've ever really experienced, and we just won the battle here of making Africana Studies a department. Like, we just had that happen. They just announced it. I can put the link in the panelist area here with the comments, but we just had that happen. And it has been an ongoing fight with the president of the college, an ongoing fight, a unifying of the Black faculty across fields and across disciplines in a way that at a college like this, where there is an active effort, I think, even as much as the people think it's benign, and even amongst the New England nicety of what it is, to somehow suppress your Blackness, right? Suppress who you are, and diminish what that means within this space. And so if there has been anything that I've seen in this experience, and from the tradition that I feel like I'm a child of and descending from, is to stay true to self in the midst of it all. And I think I have always prioritized understanding the Black community, understanding our community, understanding what we do and how we see and our perspective and our worldview from a Black American perspective. I'm also a child of immigrants, so I have a diasporic perspective. And that has always driven me in what I do as my charge. That does mean that I have confronted open and blatant remarks about how my research isn't legitimate. It has been open statements about how this doesn't matter. You have no idea the amount of stuff that Ishmael and I heard prior to us actually getting things going on that project about why this made absolutely no sense. And I think I have had to constantly remind myself to think about those who came before me and think about what they must have confronted and why I should still continue with asking the questions that I'm asking and still thinking about it in these ways and still being openly Black. And I mean, I say that like they remember Don Lemon saying he's openly Black, but like living the truth of what it is to be who we are. And so much of what we do sometimes in this field and in this discipline is done in a manner where we are frequently up against so many challenges with doing that. And I think about that too, even with the question before and how we're thinking about, well, is it too late? I think Dr. Baptist had asked that in the comments. I wonder about that too myself. Like, again, we talked about being parents, but, I think I'm a realist when it comes to somehow I see this. Like, I think the capitalist system in the United States is one that is very entrenched. It is one that has become ideologically prominent. It is one that is at the depths and in its core has many challenges and problematic pieces to what it's done. It's quite exploitative in how it is operated, especially within the US context. And I wonder about the dismantling of that. And I don't know if that will be in my lifetime, to be quite honest. Like, I think that is a longer battle, but I feel like the things that we are doing now are the building blocks towards trying to challenge these institutions and challenge these structures and challenge these types of practices that forces people to have the conversations that, although they are still baby steps, I am still encouraged that we can make enough noise and bring enough to the attention of people that they have to now respond. Like, even if they are reluctant to be there, we are seeing at least some of these conversations starting. And again, they're not ideal. They're not exactly what we want, but it is a beginning to things to come. And that does keep me hopeful. And it does keep me thinking that this is the direction. So I say, stay true to your Blackness, because the discipline might try to diminish that in many ways.
Well, Don, I don't want you to think we're ignoring your question about capitalism, so okay. I'll just say something about that. I think this is that kind of question about the Black Republicans. Every now and then, there is the media assertion that the Black Republicans are about to take over the Black Democrats, and that there's going to be a breakdown in African Americans' identification with the Democratic Party. It's just not happening. I don't know all of those Black men who were allegedly Republicans who were about to overrun our identification with the Democratic Party. And it's the same thing about capitalism. I don't think the Black capitalists are out there and are about to overrun the African American community. I mean, this is the classical race or class question, and frankly, it's still race. There may be a few, but I don't think in the main they are the drivers of the conversation about our power.
Just to follow, I'm not so much asking about sort of Black capitalism. I'm really thinking in terms of, to the extent that we say capitalism or the way it exists is impacting and exploiting Black people, right? And as we try to pull together a coalition to challenge capitalism, what happens when we also have to have a coalition to challenge white nationalism that includes the capitalists, right? The Jeff Bezoses and folks like that. We might need to tap into the power of corporate America in our coalition against the ascendant white nationalists that are, taking over. For example, like all these, when you've got a wave of folks who are trying to, undermine the election, and then the corporations come out and say, okay, we're not going to support politicians who are kind of egging that on. But what happens when, now we have to turn and kind of fight against those folks, but if their political interests, although in the past their interests had been aligned with the white populists, tribalists. I'm just thinking about this in this new landscape, who are our friends, and how do we, engage friends that then on one hand, but then they're our enemies on the other hand, if that makes sense, I mean, I don't know if I'm clarifying, but I guess I've just been thinking about that, there's so many different fights, there's so many different fights.
Yeah. The question does make sense.
Yeah.
The question does make sense, and you're really pushing us to be particular, to be specific and offering some things that people can actually do to confront and combat all this misery. That if we talk about making a better world, there have to be some practical steps toward doing that. And so as intellectuals, we do what we always do, right? You study, you keep learning, you write, you teach, and you try to come up with the language and the evidence and the research that can inform these public policy conversations, right? But then particular things to act. Voting, this country has only really been a democracy since 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in the space of my lifetime, that's been eroded, especially since the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 with Shelby versus Holder. And we see things being done on a state-by-state basis to dismantle, because once we start keeping pace, they change up the tempo. So practical thing, fight to secure voting rights at the federal and state levels, right? Practical thing, put your money, if you have some to spare, no matter how much or how little it might be, put your money in the game to back the organizations that are doing this work at the grassroots level and beyond, right? That fight is taking place in state legislatures, it's taking place in the judicial system, and there are organizations that are on the front lines in that regard, right? I think of the work that people like Cheryl Lynn Eiffel is doing with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, right? So you can put your money in the fight. And then one of the things that I've been saying to some of my students, and oh my goodness, some of them have listened, if we keep saying that we're not going to run for public office, right, especially at the state and local level, then we're leaving all of this in the hands of the very people we think are screwing things up. And so if you have that disposition, then there are ways to get involved. And I think of someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think of Cori Bush. Cori Bush was an activist, and she took down a long-standing Democratic incumbent on her way to Washington, and she's still bringing the perspective and the fire of an activist and an organizer to that work. Contests at the state level, the barriers of entry are not as great as at the federal level, right? So those are some practical things that we can do depending on our talents, our resources, that can start making the changes we want to see.
I'm appreciating you guys' comments, and I want to hear from Lori and Cheryl again before we wrap up. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to give you guys a warning for that. And just as a quick kind of, that old song popped in my mind, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, and that's the, but yet we must fight, right, through that. And so that's my thought about this, nationalists, capitalists, industrialists, all these folks are around, and you just got to, put your back against the wall and just keep swinging, I guess, as they used to say. Others, Cheryl?
Or you can go.
I don't have a comment with regards to that. I think Adolphus and Dr. Morris and Dr. Belk did a great job there. I just wanted, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to, we had a lot of comments going on in the chat as well and questions. But also, since we only have 5 or 6 more minutes, and we do want to support and move forward, support Tiffany and her initiatives, and I know she's on the call too. And as we're closing out, if it was just 1 or 2 sort of takeaways from our days together, I'm just wondering if it's some like top lines that we could focus on, or that you, Don, think that we should take away here with what we've offered in this plenary, but also in your organizing of the meeting. I'm just wondering if there's 2 or 3 takeaways or a charge that you have for us. I'm sorry.
Are you asking me to answer a question?
That's my teacher. That's my teacher. Back on you, Don. But, you know, it's just been such a rich virtual meeting, and it's such an amazing turnout. I'm just wondering if you or Tiffany have a charge for us, because you've been every year.
Yeah. So I appreciate that, Lori. And in fact, we're gonna ask Tiffany to make the final closing remarks in about 2 or 3 minutes. But I'm the questioner. You're the talent, right? but I will say this. Given my privileged position as one of the conference program chairs, I was able to see in a way that I've never been able to see before, just the breadth of what we do collectively. In terms of the various topics, the various activities, the ideas of our membership. I mean, you all wouldn't, I mean, if you haven't had this perspective, you can't appreciate just the beauty, right? The beauty and the power of all that are affiliated with NCOPE. So I never really appreciated it. So my first takeaway is just that you all are beautiful and powerful and intellectually just, not just exciting and just it was for me one of the great moments to see sort of Black, I keep coming back to this word beauty, it's been beautiful. And so that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway is the recognition of this as a peculiar political moment, and that's going to require us to be even more focused and more thoughtful in what we do in order to navigate the political moment. So that's a second general takeaway. And for me personally, again, is the inspiration of seeing folks in this space trying to do that. So those are some of my personal takeaways from this position, and also my I guess what I want to share with folks. Let me tell you guys before I send it to Tiffany. Adolphus and I were in a panel yesterday. And there was a student, a young high school student. This young lady was phenomenal. So if you weren't in that panel, you missed it. I mean, she's a high school student. She did an incredible paper. She's like a poet laureate of the Southern United. She's got all these accolades. Miss Alora Young was her name. And that was so inspiring to me to see where our young people are in terms of the ideas, the intellectual capacity, the appreciation of struggle, and the desire to participate in struggle. But then also that NCOPE gave her a space to express this, right? That was, she wanted to be a part of this, was exciting, and so it just reminded me of the potential power of our collective. And how we can kind of boost each other, and then collectively we can benefit from the individual contributions and power of all of us. So that was that. If you didn't see that, please watch the recording of that session. I think it was called like community. I don't even remember the name of the panel. It was a community building through something. But I'm on the panel and she's on the panel, so you'll be able to find it when the recordings go up. But I highly recommend you guys watch it. You'll be impressed. But with that, I will thank our panelists, Dr. Casey Morrison, Dr. Adolphus Belk, Dr. Cheryl Laird, and Dr. Lori Frazier. for an outstanding closing plenary discussion. And I appreciate your indulging my questions and allowing me to sort of wrestle with my issues publicly. And I also, I really appreciate the vibrant chat and the discussions that were going on throughout. But with that, thank you all for participating in the conference. And I'm going to turn it over now to our president, Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, to give us some closing thoughts and wrap this all up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. What a beautiful way to have closed the conference out with this wonderful panel about where we are right now and what we need to be doing next. So I want to say just a couple of very, very brief things. We initiated several years ago within the organization, in the Executive Council, a structure that represents us regionally. I'm asking everyone to look up the universities, colleges, community colleges within 50 miles of you. Look at who is teaching political science. Don't just trust and look whether or not there's a political science department, because a lot of us are in places that don't have a political science department. It might be an allied department. Maybe a political scientist is teaching in African American studies like I do, or in criminal justice or public policy or something else. But find each other and bring people in. People will come because you, Dr. Frazier, reached out to them and said, you know what, I don't know anybody at your campus. Do you know about NCOPS? Can we have you come and be there? People will show up because of that personal contact. This is the season, and we know this because 481 people registered to attend, right? On this, the Facebook Lives, the contact has been so wide. So many people are looking for our organization. So please don't be shy to bring people in that may not still, for whatever reason, know about the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. That's the first thing. The second thing is I have a number of initiatives, some at the level of task force and some that are grant research collaboratives that are going to replicate some of the work that Sekou was able to do this past year. He wrote several grants to make sure that HBCU faculty and staff and students were reached out to in a decisive way. He made contact with over 60 HBCU campuses that maybe in the past had relationships with NCOPS, but haven't recently. And what a wonderful thing. It's meant that we have had a whole nother group of people who maybe their institutions were part of the founding of NCOPS, but along the way, we just kind of lost each other, become part of that organization. I would like us to continue that work, but also reach out to the students at PWI institutions and make sure that we do the work to get them tapped into NCOPS. There's no reason they should be left behind. If you're on a campus where there's faculty members that are not coming to NCOPS and you're a student, please ask them to bring you. Please reach out to whoever is doing diversity and equity and inclusion on your campus and tell them that this is a space that you need to be in because you need to prepare yourself and you need to have the support to be able to get there. The next thing is, a lot of people have requested and said they want to be able to offer some kind of love or expression of condolence to Dr. Kathy Golden's family. I would like to see us get the Lena Harris Strohmile Fund Student Leadership Award that's named in honor of her mother. I would like us to get that endowed. Let's see if we can't do that this week, friends. The donation, I've put the information in the chat. You can also find it on our website. It's the Lena Harris Strohmile Student Leadership Award. Our development committee did a survey of our organization over the past 18 months, and they learned that every single person in our organization that was surveyed and in the focus groups, people said we need infrastructure. The most important infrastructure that we need is a campaign manager and an executive director that we pay a salary. So the development committee is going to be coming to us and asking for support and resources. Kathy and her staff at Mississippi Valley State University and our friends have done an enormous amount of voluntary work for many, many years. But in order for us to grow, we have to put our money where our mouth is and make sure that we serve this organization so that it can last for the next 52 years. So those are some of the things that are action items. So thank you for inviting me to talk about them, Lori. I really appreciate that. And you all know Margaret Clark, who usually does our registration. Lots of people call her and ask her to produce invoices after they've registered, but we would be remiss if we did not mention her and we did not hold her up and thank her again for working for this organization for so many years. Evelyn, I see your chat request to make sure that I repost that link. Again, the goal is to have that award endowed in this week. That's the goal. So if you get a phone call or a text message from me, just tell me that you put the money in there. This has been a fantastic and a wonderful and a beautiful, beautiful convening. Everybody just be blessed. May you have strength, even strength that you don't know where it comes from. And if you need anything, please reach out. We love you.
Thank you all.
I am now officially closing the 52nd National Conference of Black Political Scientists meeting.